My wife is faking it. Those were the words Arnold Benson threw over my shoulder as I lay bleeding on our living room floor. I am Helen. I am 64 years old, and on a quiet Tuesday evening in our home just outside Austin, Texas, my son-in-law nearly killed me. Let me take you back to the exact moment the world I had tried so hard to protect shattered completely. It started with a cup of coffee, or rather, it started with the deliberate cruelty of a man who believed he owned every room he stepped into. Arnold was a general contractor, a man whose loud voice and expensive suits projected success, but underneath beat the heart of a predator. That evening, I walked into the living room carrying a freshly brewed cup of coffee for my husband, Merle. Arnold stood near the oak coffee table, boasting about his construction projects. As I passed by, a sudden, brutal shove caught me entirely off guard. There was no accident. It was a sharp, calculated push to my hip that sent me violently off balance. My head struck the sharp, polished corner of the oak coffee table with a sickening crack. Pain exploded behind my eyes, a blinding blast of white-hot agony before everything plunged into blackness. When consciousness slowly bled back, I was sprawled across the hardwood floor. A pool of warm, dark blood was rapidly expanding from a deep laceration on my right temple, soaking into our rug. My ribs flared with fire with every shallow breath. And then I heard him. Arnold did not kneel beside me. He didn't check if I was breathing, nor did he panic at the sight of an old woman bleeding out. Instead, he casually stepped right over the spilled coffee and the pooling blood, looking down at me with a chilling, vacant smirk. "Tell everyone you tripped," Arnold laughed, his voice dripping with an arrogant venom that still haunts my nightmares. "You're just clumsy, Helen." Without a backward glance, he walked out the front door, leaving me to die, completely confident his words were absolute law. He thought he had won. What Arnold did not know, what he was far too arrogant to ever suspect, was who I actually was. As I lay there fighting waves of nausea, I did not scream. I clenched my teeth against the fire in my ribs, dragged my trembling arms across the floor, and reached the kitchen wall where the emergency phone hung. With fingers slick with my own blood, I punched 3 numbers. "911, what is your emergency?" a dispatcher asked. "My head," I whispered, forcing every ounce of strength into my voice. "I need an ambulance, 1422 Oak Ridge Lane." While the dispatcher guided me through keeping myself conscious with a kitchen towel pressed to my temple, I watched the taillights of Arnold's SUV disappear down our street. They say your life flashes before your eyes in moments like that, but sitting there in that pool of blood waiting for sirens, my mind anchored entirely on the last 4 years of psychological warfare that brought us here. Why did a woman of my background endure 4 years of quiet insults and escalating hostility? The answer breaks my heart. Clementine. Clementine is my only daughter. 4 years prior, when she introduced Arnold to us, he wore charismatic handshakes and grand promises about his construction empire. I mistook his arrogance for ambition. But I remember whispering to Merle that very night, "There's something hollow behind his smile." I wish I had trusted that instinct. Over the next 48 months, Arnold systematically executed a masterclass in psychological isolation, gaslighting. He convinced Clementine that her friends were toxic, her career a distraction, and her parents intrusive relics wanting to sabotage her marriage. Family dinners became rare, phone calls dwindled, every visit ended with me apologizing for things I never did, because Arnold always twisted reality. When I baked cookies, he accused me of undermining Clementine. When I bought groceries, he accused me of treating them like children. When I offered to babysit my granddaughter Maya, he sneered that I was trying to control their family. Each insult seemed small, but together they stole my confidence. 3 months before the night I collapsed, I walked into their kitchen unannounced and found Arnold shoving Clementine's arms so hard against the marble countertop that a deep purple bruise bloomed across her hip. When I gasped, Clementine immediately jumped between us, tears streaming down her face, insisting with desperate terror that she had simply slipped. She was terrified of losing her family if she admitted the truth. That was the exact second my heart hardened. That was the moment I stopped hoping Arnold would change and started preparing for the day he crossed an uncrossable line. As the ambulance doors slammed shut behind me in the freezing night, the paramedics worked frantically over my stretcher. The pain in my head was a throbbing drumbeat, but inside my mind, a cold clarity took over. Arnold thought he had gotten away with it because he was dealing with an old, fragile woman. He looked at my gray hair and saw a helpless victim. He completely forgot who I actually was before I became a grandmother. He forgot that before I retired, my name was Helen Ferguson. For 34 years, I was the senior public financial auditor and chief compliance officer for the city of Austin, Texas. I spent more than 3 decades walking into corporate boardrooms, peeling back polished facades to expose multi-million-dollar embezzlements, hidden shell companies, and fraudulent tax schemes engineered by the most cunning white-collar criminals in the state. I closed my eyes against the harsh overhead lights of the rushing ambulance. A faint, knowing smile touched my bruised lips. Arnold believed he was the hunter. He had no earthly idea that for the last 3 months, a master auditor had already laid out every single trap, secured every digital footprint, and signed every warrant necessary to dismantle his entire $1.4 million empire piece by piece. He thought he had pushed an old woman to the floor. What he didn't realize was that he had just handed the loaded gun directly to the person most qualified to pull the trigger.
The sterile white ceiling of Memorial Hospital was the first thing I saw when the surgical anesthesia finally wore off. A neurologist stood at the foot of my bed, explaining the blunt force trauma to my skull and the mild cerebral hematoma that required strict observation for the next week. My ribs felt encased in a vise of tight bandages, screaming in protest every time I took a shallow breath. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the cold, heavy weight settling into my chest. An hour later, the door swung open, and my daughter Clementine walked in holding a modest bouquet of lilies. I expected concern. I expected her to reach out and touch my hand. Instead, before she even set the flowers on the bedside table, her face tightened with an irritated frown, repeating the exact script her husband had handed her like a programmed machine, blaming my clumsiness for the fall and fretting over the extra stress I had supposedly caused him. My heart broke right there in that sterile room. Not because of the pain in my head, but because I looked at my only child and realized how thoroughly her mind had been dismantled and rewritten. She wasn't standing here as a daughter checking on her mother. She was standing here as Arnold's defense attorney, protecting her abuser inside an hospital ward. I did not argue. I did not scream or try to shake her out of her delusion. I simply offered a faint, tired smile, reached out with a trembling hand, and patted her fingers gently while murmuring a compliant agreement that it had all been my own fault. It was the exact response she needed to hear to feel comfortable. Within 10 minutes, claiming she had to rush back to manage Arnold's dinner and look after my grandmother Maya, Clementine kissed my cheek hastily and stepped out into the hallway to call her husband and report that her mother was safely subdued. The moment the heavy door clicked shut, sealing out the hallway noise, my demeanor shifted completely. The fragile, confused old woman vanished. I turned my head carefully on the pillow, reached under the hospital mattress where my personal belongings were bagged, and slid out my secure, encrypted tablet. Arnold thought he had won by isolating me, but he never understood the mind of a professional auditor. He thought my silence over the past 3 months was submission. In reality, ever since the day I found that deep purple bruise blooming across Clementine's hip, where Arnold had shoved her against the marble kitchen counter, I had been waging a quiet, calculated war. While Arnold was busy building his public image as a successful Austin contractor, I had spent 90 days secretly tearing apart the financial architecture of Benson Construction from my home study. Now, sitting in a hospital bed with an IV taped to my arm, I tapped the screen and opened the encrypted spreadsheet titled Project Audit Benson. The numbers glowed brightly against the dark screen, stark and unforgiving. Arnold's glittering empire was nothing more than an elaborate house of cards built on quicksand. My independent audit revealed 42 separate commercial and residential contracts executed using unlicensed subcontractors, a massive violation of state safety codes. Worse still, my analysis uncovered $300,000 in systemic payroll tax fraud, systematically shaved off workers' wages to pad his personal accounts. And then came the smoking gun, a complex web of fictitious invoicing totaling $2.1 million, funneled directly through a network of shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands under fictitious corporate names. It was a textbook money laundering operation executed with breathtaking arrogance by a man who assumed no one would ever bother to look past his shiny business card. The evidence was complete. Every bank routing number, every falsified tax ID, and every illicit transaction was mapped out down to the penny. I didn't waste time shedding tears or calling family members who wouldn't understand. I tapped my contacts list and dialed a direct, private number to Rick Donovan, my trusted commercial litigation attorney and old friend, whose deep voice answered on the second ring. My voice was steady, ice-cold, and carried absolute authority as I told him to drop all pleasantries and activate the emergency financial audit protocols immediately. Without hesitation, reciting specific federal agency codes, corporate entity names, and offshore routing numbers directly into the phone while my eyes locked on the glowing spreadsheet, I gave him his final orders. I instructed him to file the complete forensic audit packet directly with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division and the Texas State Board of Construction Licensing first thing in the morning, attaching digital backups of every shell company invoice and payroll discrepancy to initiate a comprehensive federal freeze before sunrise. Rick muttered his grim compliance, acknowledging the devastating impact of the strike, before the line clicked dead. I ended the call, locked the tablet screen, and slid it back beneath the mattress. Lying back against scratchy hospital pillows, I closed my eyes as the sterile hum of the medical monitors filled the silence. Let Arnold enjoy his evening. Let him sleep soundly in the bed he had made. The audit was launched, the federal machinery was turning, and the numbers were about to speak for themselves.
The federal machinery does not sleep, and neither do the numbers when a master accountant finishes balancing the ledger. While I lay resting against the starched white pillows of my hospital bed, staring out the window at the distant Austin skyline, the first shockwave hit Arnold Benson's glittering empire precisely at 8 o'clock the following morning. It started with an official notification delivered straight to his main corporate office by the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation. 14 separate commercial and residential construction sites operated by Benson Construction were slapped with unannounced mandatory safety and licensing compliance inspections, effective immediately. For a man accustomed to cutting corners and paying off local inspectors with cheap handshakes and expensive golf club memberships, this was merely an annoyance at first. I pictured him standing in his glass-walled corner office overlooking downtown, wearing one of his custom-tailored Italian suits, laughing off the notices as bureaucratic red tape. I imagined him picking up his desk phone with a smirk, calling his internal bookkeeper and office manager to bark out orders to sweep the logs, hide the uncertified subcontractor paperwork, and stall the state inspectors until he could smooth things over. Only there was nothing left to sweep under the rug. When his chief accountant tried to log into the central cloud accounting server to alter the payroll registers, the screen flashed a brilliant, unforgiving crimson. Every digital ledger, every QuickBooks Enterprise database, and every automated payroll distribution file had been remotely locked behind a bank-grade administrative override code. Before his accountant could even stammer out a warning, a second, far more devastating blow landed. The corporate checking accounts holding Benson Construction's primary operational capital were hit with an instantaneous, nationwide administrative asset freeze initiated by the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. Unlike the convenient, instantaneous fairy tale collapses you read in poorly written fiction, the dismantling of a sophisticated corporate fraud follows the cold, relentless logic of federal regulatory law. The forensic audit package I'd transmitted through Rick Donovan the previous night met every rigorous standard required by the federal material risk and fraud enactment clauses. Armed with ironclad documentation tracking 42 unlicensed subcontractor violations and $300,000 in deliberate payroll tax evasion, federal regulators did not need weeks of deliberation. They struck with absolute crushing finality. Within 90 minutes of the federal freeze hitting the wire, the dominoes began to fall with the deafening roar of a collapsing avalanche. Texas National Bank, holding the commercial equipment loans that financed Arnold's heavy machinery fleet of excavators, bulldozers, and scaffolding towers, acted with ruthless self-preservation. Citing the sudden invocation of federal risk clauses and the immediate material default on corporate banking covenants, the bank issued a formal accelerated demand for immediate repayment on the total balance due on his commercial machinery line of credit. $680,000 was suddenly called in full, payable within 48 hours, or else federal marshals would seize every piece of yellow iron parked at his job sites. Simultaneously, the bedrock of any construction empire, the material suppliers, shattered completely. The three largest industrial concrete and structural steel distributors in Travis County received automated electronic risk alerts from the commercial credit bureaus. Within hours, they all revoked Benson Construction's commercial lines of credit. They slammed their doors shut to deferred billing, demanding immediate cash-on-delivery for any future shipments, while simultaneously filing emergency civil breach of contract lawsuits for outstanding material balances. Deprived of raw materials, heavy machinery, and operational cash flow, 5 of Arnold's most lucrative commercial development projects, warehouses and retail strip malls scattered across the Austin suburbs, came to an abrupt, screeching halt. City inspectors finding no active permits, no licensed subcontractors, and unpaid municipal fees slapped giant red stop work notices across every single gate. By early afternoon, the polished facade of the great builder began to peel away, revealing the panicked, screaming tyrant underneath. Reports from employees filtered back through the local grapevine. Arnold had completely lost control in his executive suite. He smashed a crystal whiskey decanter against the boardroom wall, screaming obscenities at his trembling staff, throwing office furniture and threatening lawsuits against everyone from his bank loan officer to the state licensing commissioner.
His multi-million-dollar empire was bleeding out in real time, and he couldn't stanch the wound because he didn't even know where the blade had come from. Then came the phone call. My hospital room was quiet, save for the rhythmic, soothing beep of the heart monitor when my cell phone vibrated against the bedside table. I looked at the caller ID flashing the name of my son-in-law. His breathing sounded ragged, heavy, and frantic, like a runner who had sprinted straight off the edge of a cliff and only just realized there was no ground beneath his feet. "Did you do this?" Arnold hissed through the speaker, his voice trembling with a mixture of raw panic and venomous, suppressed fury. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice or let a single ounce of satisfaction bleed into my tone. I adjusted my pillows, looked calmly toward the window, and gave him the exact chilling dose of reality he deserved. I am sitting here, right in my hospital bed, quietly recovering from the injuries caused by your own accidental push, I replied smoothly, the voice as cold and clear as winter ice. Perhaps you should spend less time looking for someone to blame and more time figuring out how to handle your business. Before he could sputter another curse or demand answers, I tapped the screen and ended the call, cutting him off completely. Let him rage against the glass walls of his empty office. Let him scream at the empty air. The federal storm had only just begun, and the man who thought he could push people around was about to learn how heavy a falling ledger truly feels.
The panic of a drowning man is an ugly, violent thing to witness. By late afternoon, the walls of the trap I had set began to close in around Arnold Benson with absolute finality. I was still resting in my hospital bed, watching the late afternoon shadows stretch across the linoleum floor and listening to the steady, rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor when the heavy door burst open without a knock. It was Arnold. He was a ghost of the polished, arrogant contractor who had strutted through our house just days before. His custom Italian suit was wrinkled and stained with spilled coffee, his silk tie pulled loose, and deep, dark hollows bruised the pale skin beneath his frantic, bloodshot eyes. He didn't ask how my head was healing. He didn't acknowledge the intravenous lines taped to my arm or the monitors tracking my breathing. He marched straight to the side of my bed, his face twisted in unhinged animalistic fury, and jammed a trembling, accusatory finger right into my face. He erupted into a torrent of hysterical accusations, screaming that I had hired high-priced hackers and private investigators to breach his private servers, sabotage his commercial contracts, and dismantle everything he had worked for. Before I could offer a single word in response, or even shift away from his looming presence, the heavy hospital door swung open once again. Two city police officers stepped briskly into the room, their dark blue uniforms pressed and their hands resting naturally near their utility belts. They were not there by coincidence. Minutes earlier, anticipating Arnold's volatile, unpredictable descent into harassment and retaliation, my attorney, Rick Donovan, had quietly dispatched a formal notification to the precinct desk, ensuring law enforcement was standing by to intercept his inevitable meltdown. Arnold spun around, his face flushing a sickly, mottled shade of gray as he spotted the officers. With the frantic delusion of a cornered predator, he immediately tried to flip the narrative, pointing a shaky hand at me and stammering out a desperate lie to the officers, demanding they arrest me on the spot for corporate defamation, stalking, and filing false police reports. The senior officer didn't flinch. He looked from Arnold's disheveled, screaming form to me, lying calm and composed against my white pillows. In a flat, professional tone, he warned Arnold to lower his voice and step back, reminding him that a formal harassment complaint had been filed and that his current standing under federal financial investigation meant he needed to watch every step he took. Arnold shrieked in disbelieving protest, losing whatever remaining shred of composure he possessed. He blindly insisted that I was merely a confused, crazy old woman whose words carried no weight, and whom no court, bank, or jury would ever take seriously. It was the exact moment for the truth to step into the light. I did not flinch, and I did not raise my voice. Slowly, deliberately, I pushed myself up against the scratchy hospital pillows, adjusting the thin blanket over my lap with absolute calm, and quietly instructed Rick to open the laptop. My longtime attorney flipped open his secure laptop, connected the device to the room's high-definition wall-mounted display, and routed the system's audio output. I reached out, tapped my encrypted interface, and accessed the secure cloud storage linked directly to the Ring video doorbell camera installed in the front hallway of my home. I pressed play. The sterile silence of the hospital room was instantly shattered by a wave of sharp, unmistakable audio. The clear sound of heavy footsteps, the thud of a violent shove against mahogany paneling, and the sickening crack of my skull striking the edge of the oak coffee table echoed off the cold walls. And then came the single, damning line of audio captured by the digital lens. Arnold's own arrogant, mocking voice recorded as I lay bleeding on the floor, telling me to claim I had tripped because no court or jury would ever believe the word of an old woman. Tell everyone you tripped, old woman. Nobody will ever believe an old woman anyway. His recorded voice echoed through the room with terrifying clarity. The room went dead silent. The two police officers froze, their eyes shifting instantly from Arnold to me with a hardened, grim realization. The color drained entirely from Arnold's face. The arrogant swagger evaporated in a single second, leaving behind a pathetic, trembling shell of a man. His mouth opened, but no words came out, only a ragged, shallow gasp of air as he realized the trap had snapped shut around his neck. He tried to stammer out a frantic denial, claiming the recording was altered or taken out of context, but Rick silenced him completely by calmly placing the comprehensive 120-page forensic audit report squarely on top of the rolling tray over my lap. Every single page lay open before them, meticulously detailing 42 unlicensed subcontractor violations, $300,000 in deliberate payroll tax fraud, and $2.1 million of systematic money laundering routed through offshore shell companies. Every falsified tax ID and illegal bank routing number was laid bare in black and white. Arnold stared at the pages as if they were a death sentence written in stone. His knees buckled slightly, and a cold sweat broke across his forehead, soaking his collar. The senior police officer stepped forward, reaching for the heavy steel handcuffs hanging at his belt, and formally announced that Arnold was under arrest for aggravated assault resulting in severe bodily injury, alongside federal counts of large-scale financial fraud and corporate tax evasion. The metallic click of the steel cuffs snapping around Arnold's wrists sounded like a hammer driving the final nail into a coffin. He didn't fight. As the officers turned him around and marched him out of the hospital room in disgrace, his head hung low, completely broken by the very numbers and truths he thought he had buried forever. I watched the doorway empty, listening to the heavy footsteps fade down the corridor into total silence. He thought he was dealing with an old woman whose memory would fail. He never imagined that the ledger always balances in the end.
The final act of a fraudster's life rarely features flashing lights or cheering crowds. It ends in quiet humiliation under the harsh fluorescent glare of a hospital ward, surrounded by the total wreckage of his own design. Just as the senior police officer finished reading the formal charges and secured the heavy steel handcuffs around Arnold Benson's wrists, the heavy door to my hospital room swung open once again with a soft click. It was Clementine.
She stood frozen on the threshold, clutching a small canvas tote bag containing a change of clothes and a fresh thermos of coffee. Her eyes darted from the gleaming silver cuffs on her husband's wrists to the stern, professional faces of the two city police officers, and finally to the thick, open forensic audit binders resting on my hospital lap. For a long, agonizing moment, the room grew so quiet that you could hear nothing except the soft, rhythmic click of the cardiac monitor pacing out the seconds. In less than 5 minutes, the carefully manicured illusion of the successful, devoted family man Arnold had spent 4 years constructing evaporated into thin air. Every lie, every fabricated excuse, and every manipulated narrative he had fed her dissolved under the harsh, unforgiving weight of irrefutable proof. She saw the police reports, she saw the federal tax evasion codes, and then, with a sinking horror, she recalled the recorded playback of the Ring doorbell audio echoing softly in her mind, the exact moment her husband had shoved her elderly mother to the hardwood floor and laughed about it in the dark hallway. There were no theatrical tears, no dramatic pleading, and no desperate attempts to defend the man who had systematically dismantled her peace of mind. The psychological fog of emotional abuse and gaslighting finally burned away, replaced by the cold, sharp clarity of reality. She didn't look at him with sorrow. She looked at him with the quiet disdain reserved for a stranger who had overstayed his welcome in her life. Clementine took a slow, steady step forward, her gaze locking on to the trembling, disgraced man standing before her. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, hollowed out by grief, but laced with an absolute, freezing finality that left no room for debate. "You lied to me about everything, Arnold," Clementine said, her voice cutting through the sterile room like broken glass. "You abused my mother, you treated our life like a business transaction, and you laughed at our pain. Don't ever look for me, don't ever call my name, and never step foot near my daughter again." Arnold opened his mouth, desperate to salvage his defensory or issue one last manipulative plea, but no sound came out. He looked around the room for an ally, a loophole, or a sympathetic glance, finding only stone-cold silence. With no legal ground left to stand on, and the federal indictments piling higher by the hour, the reality of his situation set in with terrifying speed. Under intense pressure from his defense counsel, and faced with the airtight, unassailable financial architecture of my 90-day forensic audit, Arnold realized that fighting the charges was a mathematical impossibility. Within 48 hours, while sitting in a holding cell downtown, his defense team formally executed a comprehensive plea agreement and civil liability waiver with the federal prosecutors and civil litigants. To shave years off his inevitable prison sentence, Arnold signed away every last claim to corporate assets, personal accounts, and shared properties tied directly or indirectly to our family estate, leaving himself legally and financially bankrupt. The days that followed brought a strange, steady peace back into our home. Clementine and my granddaughter Maya moved back into the family house, where we spent quiet evenings rebuilding what had been broken and healing from the shadows of intimidation. I watched from my hospital bed as the final legal documents were processed, knowing that justice is not something that happens by accident. It is something you build, ledger by ledger, until the structure is too heavy for any liar to break. Arnold Benson entered our lives as a smooth-talking predator who thought he could outsmart the system and trample anyone in his path. He left them in handcuffs, wearing a faded orange jumpsuit,
facing a decade behind federal bars with nothing left to his name. Sometimes the universe doesn't need miracles to restore balance. It just needs an accountant who knows how to read the numbers.
The transition from a sterile hospital room back to my own home felt less like returning to a physical space and more like stepping across a threshold into an entirely different lifetime, where the air itself tasted lighter and cleaner. When Clementine and I finally walked through the front door of the house, the heavy, suffocating weight that had lingered in the hallways for years was completely gone. Every trace of the violence that dark night had brought was meticulously erased by professional cleaners. The hardwood floorboards had been thoroughly scrubbed, and the corner of the solid oak coffee table where my head had struck was expertly sanded and refinished by a local craftsman with a fresh coat of warm, clear varnish, hiding the physical scars of the past beneath a smooth, immaculate surface that looked as pristine as the day we bought it. Later that afternoon, I sat comfortably at my mahogany desk in my home study, the warm afternoon sun streaming gently through the window, wrapping my fingers around a steaming mug of chamomile tea. Clementine sat quietly across from me, her eyes red-rimmed from days of intense emotional exhaustion, but carrying a lightness in her posture and a clarity in her expression that I hadn't witnessed in over 4 agonizing years. Without a word, she stood up from her chair, walked around the edge of the desk, and wrapped her arms tightly around my shoulders, burying her face against my shoulder as the tears finally broke free in a quiet, shuddering wave of profound regret, sorrow, and overwhelming gratitude. I set my teacup down gently on the wooden coaster, reached up and stroked her hair, letting my voice carry the quiet, steady warmth of a mother who had weathered the storm safely alongside her child. "Don't look back, sweetheart," I murmured softly, my hand resting reassuringly against her cheek. "A mother's silence is simply the time it takes to build a truth no abuser can ever tear down." It was the exact emotional release she needed to finally let go of the suffocating guilt she had carried like a lead weight in her chest for years. 2 weeks later, the final pieces of our shattered world fell perfectly into place when my longtime attorney, Rick Donovan, stopped by the house with a thick, leather-bound legal folder tucked securely beneath his arm. He didn't bother with unnecessary professional pleasantries as he sat across from us at the kitchen table, opening the federal court documents with a crisp, decisive snap. The judicial machinery had moved with absolute, unforgiving precision, bringing a swift and definitive end to the nightmare. Arnold Benson's grand illusion had officially collapsed under the crushing weight of his own calculated crimes. The federal district judge handed down a definitive sentence of 7 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would spend a significant portion of his prime years behind bars with zero chance of early release. Furthermore, the state licensing board permanently revoked his commercial contractor's license, legally banning him from ever touching the building industry again. Through the court-ordered asset forfeiture and immediate liquidation of his remaining personal properties, luxury vehicles, and hidden accounts, the federal receivership successfully recovered and returned $1.2 million of his embezzled funds to corporate restitution. Rick closed the folder with a quiet thud, sliding the final set of paperwork across the polished table toward my daughter. Clementine picked up the pen without an ounce of hesitation. That very morning, she had officially filed an uncontested petition for divorce, stripping herself of his last remaining legal tether and proudly reclaiming her family name, Ferguson, alongside full, unrestricted sole custody of my granddaughter Maya. I looked out the study window, watching the golden twilight paint the Austin skyline in warm, peaceful hues. The corporate empire built on quicksand was entirely gone. The smooth-talking predator who thought he could intimidate a family of women was safely locked behind iron bars where he belonged. True strength does not scream from a podium or hide behind a polished business card. It sits quietly in the dark, balancing the ledgers, gathering the truth, and waiting for the exact right moment to let the numbers speak for themselves. 6 months after the storm finally cleared, the physical and emotional climate of our home had undergone a profound transformation, blooming right alongside the changing season. Spring had arrived in Austin with a brilliant golden warmth, casting long, cheerful rays of light across the front porch and waking up the vibrant flower beds that Clementine had spent weeks replanting from scratch. If you walked through our front door on a lazy Sunday morning, the heavy, suffocating silence that used to choke the hallways was completely gone, replaced by something far more precious. The kitchen was alive with the familiar, comforting sounds we had been robbed of for years. The gentle clatter of ceramic plates, the bubbling simmer of a Sunday stew on the stove, and the bright, unforced laughter of my granddaughter Maya playing near the back counter while Clementine and I prepped lunch together, sharing quiet smiles that required no words at all. The physical reminder of that terrifying night had long since faded into the background. The ugly wound on the side of my head had healed completely, leaving behind only a faint silver-gray crescent hidden neatly beneath my silver hair, a quiet badge of endurance and survival rather than a scar of defeat. When you spend your entire life building things, whether it is a family, a career, or a financial legacy, you learn early on that peace is never handed to you for free. It has to be guarded with unwavering vigilance. The high-profile legal battles, corporate audits, and federal indictments eventually settled into a distant hum. But the most important takeaway from those grueling months had nothing to do with revenge or spite. Real justice is never about making the wicked suffer just for the sake of watching them break. It's about building a system strong enough to stop them from ever harming innocent people again. As the months passed, the rhythm of normal life returned like a steady heartbeat. We learned to laugh again without looking over our shoulders, and the phantom fear of unexpected footsteps at the door gradually melted away into the safety of the afternoon sun. On a bright Sunday afternoon toward the end of April, the 3 generations of our family, Clementine, little Maya, and myself, sat quietly together on the wide wooden deck facing our newly landscaped garden. The air smelled of fresh soil and blooming jasmine, carrying the sweet promise of a brand new beginning that nobody could ever take away from us. As I looked across the table at my daughter and granddaughter, watching the genuine, unburdened smiles they shared without a single hint of fear or hesitation, I knew the journey of healing was finally complete. To anyone listening out there who might be fighting a silent battle behind closed doors, carrying a heavy burden you think nobody will ever believe, or doubting your own strength against a polished predator who thinks he holds all the cards, remember this: never mistake a quiet composure for weakness. True kindness and immense patience are never signs of surrender. They're simply the steady, unbreakable tools we use to build a truth that no abuser, no liar, and no corporate predator can ever tear down. The ledger always balances in the end. You just have to stay brave enough to hold the pen until the very last page is written.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, What is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.